Rejected for being too dark, Miri was discarded like trash and sent to a stranger. What should have destroyed her became her liberation. This is the story of a woman who found power exactly where they abandoned her to die. The crystal chandeliers of the Hartwell estate blazed with 1,000 candles on the night of the 1891 spring ball, casting golden light across the polished Jarrah floors where Sydney's colonial elite gathered in their finest silks and imported lace. The mansion sat high on the harbour cliffs, a monument to wealth built on pastoral land that had once belonged to the Eora people, though nobody spoke of that anymore. The ballroom hummed with the careful orchestration of social ambition, where every dance, every whispered conversation, every strategic introduction carried the weight of family fortunes and political alliances. Miri Hartwell stood at the edge of it all, feeling like a shadow trying to exist in blinding light. At 24 years old, she had learned to make herself small despite her fuller figure, to fade into corners, despite the richness of the burgundy silk gown her mother had commissioned from the most expensive dressmaker in Sydney. The dress had cost more than most working families earned in a year, its fabric imported from England, its beadwork painstakingly hand-stitched by seamstresses who had laboured for weeks. But no amount of money could purchase what Miri truly needed: acceptance in a society that had decided she would never quite belong. Her reflection in the gilt-edged mirrors told the story her family desperately tried to hide. While her younger sisters had inherited their mother's pale English complexion and delicate features, Miri bore the unmistakable evidence of her Aboriginal grandmother. Her skin held a warm bronze tone that no amount of rice powder could conceal. Her dark eyes were too wide and expressive for fashionable beauty standards, and her figure curved in ways that scandalized the corseted ideal of colonial femininity. But it was more than appearance. There was something in the way she moved, the way she carried herself, that whispered of connections her family had spent decades trying to sever. The musicians struck up a waltz, and Miri watched as young women were swept onto the dance floor by eager partners. Her sisters, Eleanor and Catherine, glided past with society bachelors, their laughter tinkling like expensive crystal. Nobody glanced in Miri's direction. She had learned not to expect it anymore. This was her 7th season being presented at social functions, and with each passing year, the hope that had once flickered in her chest grew dimmer until it was barely an ember. "Poor thing," she heard Mrs. Ashford whisper to her companion behind a lace fan, the words carrying across the space with cruel clarity. Such a pity about the Hartwell girl. They say there's savage blood in the family line, though Victoria swears it's just unfortunate colouring from a Spanish ancestor, but one only needs to look at her to know the truth. The words carried across the space between them like arrows finding their mark. Miri's fingers tightened around her own fan, the ivory sticks pressing into her palms until they left red marks. She had heard variations of this conversation her entire life, but it never stopped hurting. Each comment was a reminder that she existed in a space between worlds, claimed fully by neither, rejected by one because she carried too much of the other. Young Geoffrey Thornton approached with his usual affected swagger, his blonde hair gleaming in the candlelight, his evening suit tailored to perfection by the finest tailor in the colony. For one desperate moment, Miri felt hope flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps someone would finally see past the surface to the person she truly was, to the intelligence she had been forced to hide, to the kindness that had nowhere to go. But Geoffrey walked straight past her to where her sister Eleanor stood, bowing with exaggerated courtesy that made Eleanor blush prettily. Miri became invisible once again, a piece of furniture to walk around without acknowledgement. Across the ballroom, Charles Hartwell observed his eldest daughter with the cold calculation of a man who viewed everything through the lens of profit and loss. His mining investments and pastoral holdings had made him one of the wealthiest men in the colony, a self-made fortune built on shrewd business sense and ruthless determination, but wealth could not erase certain stains. His daughter stood as a living reminder of the youthful indiscretion that had nearly destroyed his social standing 25 years ago. An Aboriginal woman, beautiful and mysterious, who had captured his heart one summer before reality and family pressure had forced him into a more appropriate marriage with Victoria Pemberton, daughter of a prominent merchant family. The Aboriginal woman had died in childbirth, taking her secrets and her dignity with her. Charles had taken the infant Miri into his household, claimed her as his own legitimate daughter, and spent the next 24 years trying to make her into something she could never quite be. He had hired the finest tutors, purchased the most expensive wardrobes, introduced her to every eligible bachelor his connections could reach. Now she stood there, neither fish nor fowl, too dark for white society, and too removed from her mother's people to belong there either. A failed investment that he needed to resolve before it damaged his other daughter's prospects further. Victoria Hartwell glided across the floor toward Miri with practiced grace, her pale skin and perfect posture, embodying everything their world valued. Every movement was calculated, every gesture refined through years of training in the art of being a proper colonial lady. She touched her daughter's arm with gloved fingers, the gesture more correction than comfort. "Stand up straight," she murmured, her smile never wavering for the benefit of watching eyes. "And stop looking so melancholy. You're making people uncomfortable with that expression. Nobody wants to approach someone who looks like they're attending a funeral rather than the season's finest ball." Miri straightened her spine, forcing her face into the pleasant mask she had perfected over years of practice. But inside something was crumbling. How much longer could she maintain this pretense of belonging in a world that made her feel like an unwelcome guest in her own life? How many more balls, how many more seasons, how many more years of this slow torture? The evening dragged on with painful slowness. Miri found herself seated among the elderly matrons and young girls, not yet of marriage age, watching the social dance unfold before her like a play in which she had no role. She noticed everything with the sharp clarity of the excluded, the way conversations stopped when she approached groups, the pitying glances from sympathetic older women who remembered her as a child and perhaps felt some guilt for the cruelty of their society, the cruel smirks from young men who found entertainment in others' misfortune. Thomas Whitmore, heir to a shipping fortune and considered one of the season's most eligible bachelors, leaned against a marble column surrounded by his privileged friends. His voice carried clearly across the space, pitched deliberately loud enough for Miri to hear. "I heard old Hartwell's getting desperate, offering a substantial dowry to anyone willing to take the eldest daughter off his hands. £5,000, they say. But who would want to marry someone who looks like she belongs in the Aboriginal camps, rather than the drawing room? Not for 10,000. The laughter that followed was like broken glass in Miri's ears. She felt her cheeks burn, not with shame, but with a rising anger she had spent years suppressing. These people, who measured human worth by skin tone and bank balance, who built their fortunes on stolen land and broken promises, who wore their Christianity like fashionable accessories while practicing cruelty as a social sport, they were the ones who should feel shame. When the ball finally ended near midnight, and the Hartwell family climbed into their ornate carriage for the journey home, the silence was heavy with unspoken recriminations. Eleanor and Catherine whispered to each other about the evening's triumphs, comparing marriage prospects with the enthusiasm of shoppers at a market, each trying to determine which suitor was most advantageous. Victoria stared out the window with a tight expression that suggested both disappointment and resignation, her dreams of seeing all her daughters well married slipping further away. Charles sat with his arms crossed, his jaw working as if chewing over difficult calculations and unpleasant decisions. Miri watched the gaslit streets roll past, feeling strangely detached from her own body. The Sydney night was warm and humid, carrying the smell of salt water and eucalyptus from the harbour and bushland beyond the city's reach. Somewhere out there, beyond the ordered streets and proper houses, beyond the cultivated gardens and carefully maintained boundaries, existed another world. A world her mother had come from, a world Miri had only glimpsed through the stories of servants and the fragments her grandmother had shared before her death when Miri was 12. The carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones, each rotation carrying them closer to the mansion that had always felt more like a beautiful prison than a home. Miri closed her eyes and made a silent wish to whatever spirits might be listening, to the ancestors she had never been allowed to know. She wished for escape, for freedom, for a place where she could exist without apology, without constantly trying to be smaller and paler and more acceptable. She had no idea that her wish was about to be granted in the most unexpected and devastating way possible. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miri's bedroom, painting patterns across the imported wallpaper. She had slept poorly, haunted by fragments of the previous night's humiliations, the whispers, the laughter, the deliberate turning away. Each memory was a fresh wound that refused to heal. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. The housemaid, Mary, entered with downcast eyes. Your father wishes to see you in his study immediately, Miss Miri. The girl's voice carried an unusual tension, as if she knew something terrible was brewing. Miri dressed carefully in a simple day dress of dove grey cotton, chosen for its modesty. Perhaps if she looked subdued enough, whatever awaited her would be less severe. She pinned her dark hair back severely, trying to minimize every feature that marked her as different. But a small voice whispered that no amount of concealment would change who she fundamentally was. The walk to her father's study felt like a journey to judgment. The portraits of Hartwell ancestors lined the walls, pale faces staring down with stern disapproval. These were people who had built their fortune on certainty and convention, who measured success in pounds sterling and social position. Charles Hartwell's study was a monument to masculine authority. Dark timber paneling absorbed the light, making the room feel like a cave of decisions. Maps of pastoral holdings covered one wall, showing the vast tracts of land he controlled. The heavy mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface covered with papers representing the machinery of wealth. Her father stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the manicured gardens. He didn't turn when she entered, leaving her to stand in awkward silence. The ticking of the ornate clock marked seconds until the axe fell. "Father, you wish to see me," Miri finally said, her voice steady despite the anxiety tightening her chest. Charles turned slowly, and what Miri saw in his face chilled her. It wasn't anger. It was cold calculation, the expression of a man solving an unpleasant business problem. She was a ledger entry that needed to be balanced. "Sit down," he commanded, gesturing to the chair before his desk. Miri sat, folding her hands with careful composure. "You are 24 years old," he began without preamble. "At your age, your mother had already borne me 3 children and secured valuable connections. Your sisters have attracted numerous suitable prospects, but you have become an embarrassment that I can no longer afford to maintain." Each word landed like a physical blow. Miri had known her father's affection was conditional, but hearing it stated so boldly stripped away any remaining illusions. "I have tried everything," Charles continued, pacing behind his desk. "The finest dresses, accomplished tutors, introduction to every eligible bachelor in the colony. I've spent thousands trying to make you marriageable, but nothing can overcome the obvious reality of what you are. People whisper about Aboriginal blood in our family line. Your existence proves those whispers true." "I didn't choose to be born," Miri said quietly. "I didn't choose any of this." "No," Charles agreed, "but I am choosing to resolve this situation in a way that serves some useful purpose." He withdrew an official document bearing government seals. "The colonial administration has been conducting an experiment. Rather than executing captured Aboriginal warriors who resist settlement, they are placing them on reserved lands with the condition that they accept civilizing influences." Cold dread crept through Miri's body. "There is an Aboriginal man," Charles said, tapping the document. "Name of Jara, approximately 30 years of age. He was taken from mission custody after repeated attempts to return to his traditional lands. The authorities have designated a remote section of Crown land for his use. The experiment requires that he be provided with a wife from colonial society." The room seemed to tilt. "You're going to send me to live with this man?" she said. It wasn't a question. "It solves multiple problems efficiently," Charles replied. "The government fulfills its experimental requirements. I remove an ongoing source of social embarrassment, and you finally serve some practical purpose. You will be transported to the settlement in 3 days. Legal documents have been prepared designating you as his assigned spouse." "You're giving me away like unwanted property," Miri said, her voice shaking with rage, "to a stranger. Because I'm not pale enough, not acceptable enough for your precious social standing." "I am providing you with a husband," Charles corrected coldly, "which is more than anyone else has been willing to offer despite the substantial dowry I've made available. At least this way your existence will contribute something, rather than simply draining resources." Victoria Hartwell appeared in the doorway, drawn by raised voices. She took in the scene and understood immediately. For a moment, something flickered across her face that might have been maternal distress, but it passed quickly, replaced by careful neutrality. "It's for the best, Miri," she said with forced gentleness. "You'll have a home, a husband. Many women have far less." "Many women aren't being handed over to prisoners like payment for some social debt," Miri replied, standing now. "How can you pretend this is anything other than disposal of an inconvenient reminder?" Victoria's face tightened. Your father has been more than generous in raising you as his legitimate daughter, despite the circumstances of your birth. This arrangement is an opportunity, not a punishment. But Miri could see the lie in her stepmother's eyes. This was absolutely a punishment. Punishment for being born with the wrong skin tone, the wrong features, the wrong bloodline. When? Miri asked, her voice hollow. The day after tomorrow at dawn, Charles replied, already dismissing her. A police escort will accompany you. You may bring one trunk of personal belongings. The arrangement is permanent and irrevocable. Miri left the study on trembling legs, walking through the mansion with new eyes. The expensive furniture, the imported paintings, the carefully curated perfection suddenly revealed themselves as an elaborate stage set, a performance of respectability built on theft and maintained through cruelty. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Her father was sending her away, not because she had done anything wrong, but because her existence made him uncomfortable. She was being exiled for the crime of being born. But as afternoon light faded and evening crept across the harbour, something unexpected began to stir within her. Beneath the fear and grief and anger, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Tomorrow she would leave behind the endless judgment, the constant humiliation, the suffocating weight of trying to be something she could never be. Whatever awaited her might be difficult, but at least it would be different. At least it would be away from here. As darkness fell, Miri began to pack her trunk. She chose practical clothes over elaborate gowns, sturdy boots over delicate slippers. She packed the few books her grandmother had given her before she died, books that spoke of traditional knowledge and healing practices. She included the journal where she had secretly recorded the stories and songs her Aboriginal grandmother had shared in whispered conversations when nobody else was listening, fragments of language and wisdom that she had preserved even though she didn't fully understand their significance. These were the pieces of herself that mattered, the fragments of identity she had been forced to hide. Tomorrow her old life would end. What would begin in its place remained terrifyingly unknown. But as Miri closed the trunk and extinguished her lamp, she made herself a promise. Whatever happened, wherever she was going, she would stop apologizing for existing. She would stop trying to be less than she was. She would find a way to become fully herself, even if that self remained a mystery she had yet to discover. The night settled over Sydney, and in a bedroom overlooking the harbour, a young woman prepared for exile that might somehow become liberation. The first weeks at the settlement passed in a careful dance of proximity without intrusion. Miri and Jara circled each other like wounded animals learning to trust, neither quite sure how to bridge the space between stranger and something more. The other families watched with interest, ranging from friendly curiosity to cautious assessment. Miri quickly learned that survival here required practical skills her expensive education had never considered teaching. She burned her first attempts at cooking over an open fire, ruined clothes trying to wash them in the creek, and struggled with tasks that seemed effortless when others performed them. But she refused to be defeated by inexperience. Jara watched her efforts with an expression that gradually shifted from skepticism to respect. On the fifth morning, when she emerged from her shelter to find him waiting with a basket of fresh fish and kindling already arranged for a proper cooking fire, she understood it was his way of offering help without highlighting her struggles. "My grandmother tried to teach me traditional ways when I was young," Miri said as they worked together to prepare the morning meal, "but my father forbade it. He wanted me to be completely English, as if pretending could change what I am." Jara's hands stilled over the fish he was cleaning. "What was your grandmother's name? Which country did she come from?" "Ngari," Miri replied, and speaking the name felt like opening a door that had been locked for years. "She came from somewhere west of Sydney. She died when I was 12. I still remember her voice telling me stories my father said I should forget." "What kind of stories?" "Stories about the land, about how everything is connected, about plants that heal and seasons that speak. She would sneak into my room after everyone was asleep and whisper these things to me like secrets." Jara was quiet for a long moment. The old woman wasn't just sharing stories. She was trying to give you something your father was stealing. Your identity, your birthright, your connection to something older and deeper than colonial society will ever understand. The words hit Miri with unexpected force. "I wrote down everything I could remember," she admitted. "In a journal I kept hidden, fragments of language, songs, stories about different plants and their uses. I didn't understand most of it, but I couldn't bear to let it disappear completely. "Show me," Jara said simply. That afternoon, Miri retrieved her journal from its hiding place in her trunk. Jara studied each page with intense concentration. When he finally looked up, his expression had transformed. "Do you understand what you have here?" he asked quietly. "This is healing knowledge, plant medicine. Some of these I recognize from my own people's traditions. Others are specific to your grandmother's country. This is wisdom that the missions and government policies are trying to erase. Your grandmother gave you something precious beyond measure." "But I don't know how to use any of it," Miri said, frustration coloring her voice. "Then we teach each other," Jara replied, and his smile was the first genuine one she had seen from him. "You have knowledge from your grandmother's people. I have knowledge from mine. We can weave them together, create something that honors both while serving the community here." The settlement was indeed in need of healing knowledge. Western medicine was scarce and expensive, but traditional healing faced its own challenges. Many plants that grew in one area didn't exist in another. Jara began taking Miri on long walks through the surrounding bush, teaching her to see what she had previously looked past. Every plant had a purpose, every season a rhythm, every part of the landscape a story. He showed her which leaves could reduce fever, which bark could be brewed for stomach ailments, which roots provided strength to women preparing for childbirth. In turn, Miri shared what her grandmother had taught her, and Jara helped her understand how to apply it. The healing knowledge began to take shape in her hands, transforming from abstract concepts into practical medicine. When young Kalina, from 2 shelters over, developed a persistent cough, Miri prepared a mixture based on her grandmother's teachings and Jara's guidance. 3 days later, the child was breathing easily, and her mother looked at Miri with gratitude that made something warm bloom in her chest. News of the successful healing spread through the small community. More people began approaching with ailments: an older man with joint pain, a woman suffering headaches, a young mother whose infant struggled with feeding. Miri approached each case with a mixture of her grandmother's wisdom and Jara's expertise, always treating each person with respect and genuine care. Working together created a bridge between Miri and Jara that conversation alone could never have built. In the shared purpose of healing, they began to truly see each other. Miri discovered that Jara carried deep wounds from his time in the mission system. "They tried to break me," he told her one evening as they sat by the creek sorting through plants. "Told me my people were primitive, our ways foolish superstition. They wanted to turn me into a copy of them, but a copy they would always consider inferior. I decided I would rather die free than live as their shadow version of a human being." Miri understood that sentiment in her bones. "I spent my whole life trying to be acceptable to people who had already decided I wasn't. Trying to be thinner, paler, quieter, smaller, apologizing for existing in a body and skin that wouldn't conform to their standards. Out here, for the first time, I can just be." "You're stronger than you realize," Jara said, and the admiration in his voice made Miri's heart flutter. "Most colonial women would have collapsed within days of arriving here. You've adapted, learned, refused to be defeated. That takes real strength." As weeks turned into months, something subtle but profound was shifting between them. The careful distance they had maintained began to feel less like necessity and more like denial. Miri found herself watching Jara when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing the grace in his movements, the kindness in his interactions, the depth of knowledge he carried so lightly, and she began to see in his eyes that he was watching her too, that the respect he showed her was deepening into something warmer, that the space between their separate dwellings felt increasingly like an arbitrary boundary. One afternoon, while they were preparing medicines together, their hands brushed as they reached for the same container. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a shock through Miri. When she looked up, she found Jara's eyes already on her face, and in them she saw the same awareness reflected back. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched, charged with possibility. "Miri," Jara said, and her name in his voice was both a question and an answer. "Yes," she whispered. "This isn't what I expected," he admitted. "You aren't what I expected. I thought I would resent whoever they sent me, would maintain distance to protect myself, but you've become important to me. Your presence here feels less like imprisonment and more like home." Tears pricked at Miri's eyes. Home was a concept that had always eluded her, but sitting here with Jara, their medicine work spread between them, the sounds of the community around them, She understood what he meant. This felt like home. "For me too," she said simply. "You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing. A sense of purpose. A feeling that my existence matters in ways that have nothing to do with being acceptable to people who were never going to accept me anyway." Jara reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his hand cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "May I?" he asked, and the question was both specific and expansive. Miri answered by leaning into his touch, by letting her eyes fall closed, by opening herself to possibility. When he kissed her, it was soft and careful, a question rather than a demand. But Miri's response was clear and certain. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing she hadn't realized she was carrying, with gratitude and desire, and the exquisite relief of being chosen rather than assigned. That night, Miri did not sleep in her separate dwelling, and the walls between them, both physical and emotional, dissolved into something far more real and precious than any arrangement imposed by colonial authorities could ever be. Dawn broke over Sydney Harbour in shades of rose and gold, but Miri saw nothing beautiful in it. The sunrise marked the beginning of a journey into complete uncertainty. She stood in the entrance hall wearing her most practical travelling dress, a trunk at her feet. Her family remained conspicuously absent. No farewells, no embraces, just the housemaid Mary with tears running down her face. "I'll miss you, Miss Miri," the girl whispered. "You were always kind to us." The words touched something raw in Miri's heart. A servant's tears were the only genuine emotion her departure had inspired. She embraced Mary quickly, then walked through the front door without looking back. The police wagon waited in the circular drive. Sergeant William Crawford stood beside it, a weathered man whose face showed decades of colonial service. He touched his hat respectfully. "Miss Hartwell, I'll be escorting you to the settlement. 3 days' journey inland through bush country." Miri climbed into the wagon without assistance, settling onto the hard bench seat. As the wagon lurched into motion, she allowed herself one final glance at the mansion. She felt nothing as it disappeared from view. Not grief, not relief, just a strange emptiness. The first day took them beyond Sydney's boundaries into bush country that stretched westward toward the mountains. The landscape transformed from cultivated farms into something wilder, more ancient. Eucalyptus forests rose on either side, their grey-green leaves rustling in the warm breeze. The air smelled different here, clean and sharp, carrying scents of earth and sap and distance. Sergeant Crawford proved unexpectedly talkative once they were away from the city. He spoke of his years in the colonial police, of complex negotiations between Aboriginal communities and incoming settlers. "The man you're being sent to," Crawford said, as they made camp the first night. "Jara, I've met him several times. He's not what you might expect." Miri had been trying not to think too much about the man who would become her husband by government decree, but now curiosity overcame caution. "What do you mean?" "He's educated, spent time at the Warwick Mission when he was younger, learned English, reading, writing, but he never stopped being who he truly was, kept escaping, kept trying to return to his country. The authorities finally decided it was easier to give him land of his own and monitor him there. Why would they do that instead of releasing him? Because he knows things, traditional knowledge about the land, water sources, plant medicines. Some administrators recognize that knowledge has value, even if they won't admit it publicly. So they're conducting this experiment, or creating a way to control what they can't eliminate," Miri said quietly. Crawford looked at her with new respect. "You're sharper than your father gives you credit for." "Yes, there's that element too." But Jara agreed to the terms because at least he'd be on country, even if it's not his traditional country. That night, as Miri lay wrapped in blankets beneath the vast southern sky, she thought about the man who had also been forced into this arrangement. He was a prisoner, being offered modified captivity in exchange for accepting a stranger into his life. They were both pawns in a game neither had chosen to play. The second day took them deeper into territory that felt increasingly removed from the world Miri had known. They passed through areas where signs of Aboriginal presence remained visible. Rock arrangements that Crawford explained were message stones, trees scarred where bark had been removed, cleared areas that had been deliberately managed with fire over countless generations. "Your father mentioned you have Aboriginal heritage," Crawford said carefully, "through your birth mother." Miri had spent her life hiding that truth, but out here, far from judging eyes, it felt less like a shameful secret. "Yes, My mother died when I was born. I never knew her. My grandmother shared some stories before she passed, but my father discouraged any connection to that part of my identity. Might be that connection will serve you well where you're going, Crawford observed. The settlement includes several Aboriginal families. Having some understanding of traditional ways could help you find your place among them. On the third day, they reached the settlement as the afternoon sun painted the bush in shades of amber and honey. The designated area occupied a broad valley between low hills, following a creek that sparkled with reliable water. Several simple structures dotted the landscape, built from timber and bark in a style that combined traditional methods with colonial materials. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played near the creek. Jara was waiting when the wagon pulled up. Miri's first sight of him stole the breath from her lungs. He stood perfectly still, watching their approach with an expression that gave nothing away. He was tall and lean, his body carrying the kind of fitness that came from a lifetime of movement through challenging country. His skin was several shades darker than hers, rich brown that spoke of deep ancestral connection to this land. But it was his eyes that captured Miri's attention. Dark and depthless, they held intelligence, pain, dignity, and something she couldn't quite name. When their gazes met, she felt a shock of recognition that made no logical sense. "This is the woman they're sending you," Crawford said. "Miss Miri Hartwell. Miri, this is Jara." Jara's jaw tightened. He addressed Crawford in English that carried only the faintest accent. "So the great experiment continues. They think they can break our spirits by chaining us to strangers and calling it civilization." "I didn't ask for this either," Miri said before she could stop herself. The words came out sharp, fueled by 3 days of travel and 24 years of rejection. "Do you think I want to be here? My own father disposed of me like unwanted furniture because I wasn't acceptable in his society. I'm as much a prisoner as you are." Jara's attention shifted fully to her, surprise flickering across his features. He had expected submission or perhaps fear. Her anger seemed to catch him off guard. Crawford cleared his throat. "The legal documents have been filed. You're to be considered married under colonial law. The conditions of Jara's land use require he accept this arrangement. I'll be checking in monthly to ensure compliance." "And if we refuse?" Jara asked. "Then you return to imprisonment, and Miss Hartwell becomes a ward of the state in considerably less pleasant circumstances," Crawford replied bluntly. "Neither of you have real choices here. The question is what you do with the situation you've been given." After Crawford departed, Miri and Jara stood in uncomfortable silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent colors. Kookaburras began their evening laughter in the surrounding trees. "I have a second shelter prepared," Jara finally said, gesturing toward a smaller structure about 20 meters away. "You can sleep there. I won't force anything on you that you don't choose freely. Whatever the government documents say, you're not my property." The kindness in those words, coming after everything else, nearly undid Miri's composure. "Thank you," she managed. He helped her carry her trunk to the smaller dwelling. Inside, the structure was simple but well-made, with a raised sleeping platform, a small table, and openings designed to catch breeze while providing privacy. Someone had left blankets folded neatly on the bed, along with a water container and a lamp. "The creek is safe to drink from," Jara said from the doorway. "There's a garden area behind my dwelling where we grow food. The other families here will probably visit tomorrow." "I'm sorry," Miri said suddenly. "This must be terrible for you, having a stranger forced into your life." Jara studied her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "They usually send women who are afraid or disgusted or determined to civilize the savage. You seem mostly angry." "I am angry," Miri confirmed. "Furious. At my father, at the society that rejected me, at a system that treats human beings like property, but not at you. We're both victims of the same ugly machinery." Something shifted in Jara's expression, a slight softening that might have been the beginning of respect. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure out how we navigate this impossible situation." After he left, Miri sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry, deep sobs that came from somewhere beneath her carefully constructed composure. She cried for the family that had never truly claimed her, for the society that had rejected her, for the future that would never exist. But when the tears finally subsided, she felt something unexpected settling into their place. The beginning of determination. She was done apologizing for existing, done trying to be small enough, pale enough, acceptable enough. Whatever life she was going to build in this strange place, it would be built on her own terms, and perhaps, just perhaps, with the help of a man who understood what it meant to exist between worlds. 18 months had passed since Miri's arrival at the settlement, and the small community had transformed. What had been an administrative experiment had evolved into something genuine, built on mutual respect and knowledge that honored both traditional wisdom and practical innovation. Miri and Jara's healing work had become the heart of this transformation. Their combined knowledge had saved lives and eased suffering. Word spread through the region, drawing people from distant areas seeking their help. Miri had found the purpose that had always eluded her in Sydney's drawing rooms. She was working in the garden behind their shared dwelling when Sergeant Crawford arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks ahead of his usual schedule. The expression on his weathered face carried a warning that made Miri's hands still among the medicinal plants. "Miss Hartwell," he said, dismounting carefully, "I'm afraid I bring unpleasant news. Your father has petitioned the colonial administration for your immediate return to Sydney." "On what grounds?" "He's arranged a marriage for you. A widower named Reginald Pemberton, twice your age, willing to overlook your circumstances in exchange for a substantial dowry. Your father argues this represents a significant social opportunity." Miri felt Jara arrive behind her. "She's not going anywhere," he said with quiet certainty. Crawford sighed heavily. "Your arrangement here was always part of a broader experiment. If Mr. Hartwell has found a conventional marriage prospect, the authorities consider that a successful resolution." "A successful resolution," Miri repeated, bitter laughter escaping. "They sent me here as disposal of an embarrassment. Now my father wants me back because I'm useful again, as if I'm property to be retrieved at his convenience." After Crawford departed, rage kindled in Miri's chest. For 18 months she had been free. "I won't go," she told Jara, who stood beside her radiating controlled fury. "I don't care what documents they have. I am not returning to that life." "Then we need evidence that sending you back would be unjust," Jara replied. "We need to show them what you've built here." The community rallied with remarkable speed. Everyone understood what her departure would mean. 3 days later, a much larger party arrived from Sydney. Hartwell had sent his lawyer Edmund Fitzwilliam, 6 constables, and government official Robert Ashford in multiple carriages. Their arrival suggested they expected resistance. Miri stood waiting, wearing practical clothing, hair in a simple plait. She looked purposeful and entirely unlike the miserable young woman who had left Sydney. Jara stood at her right, Elder Kalani at her left. Around them gathered the community and settler families. "Miss Hartwell," Fitzwilliam began, unfolding documents from his leather case, "your father has exercised his legal authority to recall you to Sydney. You are expected to comply immediately." "I'm 25 years old," Miri replied, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. "Well past the age of majority. My father has no authority over me, and I decline his demand." Ashford stepped forward with a stern expression. "Your arrangement exists only through government authorization. If you refuse to leave, we can remove the settlement's legal status and relocate everyone here." Before Jara could speak, Kalani stepped forward with dignity. "This woman is not prisoner or experiment. She is healer, teacher, essential community member. She has saved lives, including my grandson's. To remove her would be cruelty to all people who depend on her knowledge and care. The medical claims of Indigenous people are not recognized in colonial courts," Fitzwilliam said coldly. "Then hear from people whose testimony you do recognize," said a voice from the crowd. Thomas Brennan dismounted from his horse. The wealthy pastoralist was known throughout the district, a man whose word carried weight. "Mr. Ashford, you know my reputation," Brennan said. "Miss Hartwell saved my wife when the colonial doctor declared her terminal. Remove her, and you sentence others to preventable suffering." Margaret Donovan stepped forward. "My son was dying. The doctor gave up. Miss Hartwell saved him with medicines from local plants." The testimonies came one after another. Aboriginal mothers whose labors had been eased, settler children whose fevers had broken, men whose injuries had healed, women whose pain had been relieved. Each story added undeniable weight. Fitzwilliam looked increasingly uncomfortable. Ashford's stern expression had shifted to something approaching uncertainty. These were documented results from people whose testimony would be believed in colonial courts. Then, a carriage bearing the Hartwell crest arrived. Victoria Hartwell emerged, looking out of place in Sydney finery. Victoria approached until she found Miri. Mother and daughter looked at one another for a long moment. "Miri," Victoria said, her voice unsteady in a way Miri had never heard before. "Your father sent me to ensure your compliance, to explain the advantage of the marriage he has arranged." She paused, struggling visibly with what came next. "But I can't do that. I can't ask you to come back to that life. When I received word of what you were doing here," Victoria continued, tears now sliding down her perfectly powdered cheeks, "I told myself it couldn't be true. But I've been making inquiries. I've spoken with families you've helped, and I realized something terrible. We tried to force you into a shape that was never meant to fit you. We measured your worth by standards that had nothing to do with what truly matters. We were wrong, Miri. I was wrong." "Why are you telling me this now?" Miri asked, her own tears rising. "Because I've lived my whole life doing what was expected rather than what was right," Victoria replied, her voice breaking. "And I won't make you do the same. You're an adult. You've found your purpose. You've found love with someone who sees and values you for who you truly are. That's more than most women ever receive, including me." Crawford cleared his throat. "Mr. Ashford, with respect, I've monitored this settlement for 18 months. Miss Hartwell's presence here has documented positive effects on both Aboriginal and settler health outcomes. Removing her would harm colonial interests." Ashford looked between Miri, the assembled community, the settler witnesses, and Victoria's tear-stained face. "Miss Hartwell, are you stating unequivocally that you wish to remain here of your own free will?" "Absolutely," Miri replied without hesitation. "This is my home. These are my people. This is my work. And this man," she reached for Jarrah's hand, "is my husband in every way that matters." Ashford sighed heavily. "Then I see no basis for forcible removal. If her presence serves community health interests, as multiple credible witnesses have testified, removing her would be counterproductive." After the officials left, Victoria approached Miri again. "Will you forgive me? For all the years I tried to change you instead of seeing you." Miri felt something old and painful finally releasing. "I forgive you," she said, "but I won't forget. What happened shaped me." "I wouldn't ask you to," Victoria replied. "You've built something remarkable here. I'm proud of you, Miri, truly proud." 5 years later, Miri sat on the veranda watching their children play. Ngari, 4 years old, and Kuri, barely 2, ran through the garden. The settlement had become a model community where Aboriginal and settler families lived in genuine cooperation. Visitors came from across the colony. Jarrah settled beside her with tea. "The government is officially designating this a permanent settlement with recognized medical facilities. They're discussing funding for expansion." Miri smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "They're finally understanding that real healing requires more than just colonial medicine." They sat watching the sun paint the sky in amber and rose. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Jarrah asked. Miri watched Ngari help her brother navigate stepping stones in the garden. "Sometimes, but mostly I'm grateful things unfolded exactly as they did. That rejection forced me to find something far more valuable than social acceptance. If they had accepted me, I might have spent my whole life trying to be someone else's version of acceptable. Instead, I became authentically myself." That night, Miri stood at the window. Jarrah wrapped his arms around her. "No regrets?" he murmured against her hair. Miri turned in his embrace, kissing him. "Not a single one," she whispered. "This life, this love, this purpose. It's more than I ever dreamed possible." She felt complete, valued, profoundly at home, not despite the journey that had brought her here, but because of it. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across a community that proved what was possible when people were allowed to become fully themselves. And Miri understood that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in circumstances that initially looked like punishment. Sometimes being cast away is the only path to being truly found.